Now, the news now from Trump's trade policy to coming after the independence of the US central bank. Our next guest is alarmed. Daron Acemoglu won the 2024 Nobel Prize in Economics in an exclusive interview with NDTV. Acemoglu says that the world needs to brace for two recessions. Here's our exclusive interview. Acemoglu, for joining us here on Washington Watch. Our first question here to you, really. Mr. Acemoglu, whatever happens in the United States has repercussions on the rest of the world. What do you see happening with the US economy in the long term and short term?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I don't think we can know that yet, but I think there are two issues to really appreciate, especially from the point of view of India and other emerging economies. First of all, what happens in the United States has ramifications around the world, exactly like you said, but that includes domestic policy as well. A lot of the world is focusing on tariff policy because that's immediately relevant. But Trump's bigger agenda is to create an executive presidency with him at the top with few constraints and a lot of power concentrated in his hands. If that succeeds, that's a fundamental transformation of US institutions with a even huger transformation of US economy following. But once you also make this observation, you also see that the form of tariffs has specific significance. There is no economic theory, absolutely none, that would justify the form of tariffs that President Trump is imposing. But it makes sense if your point is to centralize power in your hands. Now he can make deals with India, with Bangladesh, with China, with the European Union. More importantly, he now has a big weapon in his negotiations against US companies. Apple now has to be much more subservient to Donald Trump because he can put tariffs on Apple's supply chain. So it's a power play more than anything else.
Right, Professor Acemoglu, given everything you've told us, what are the odds of a US recession?
Well, I think there are two separate recessions that we should be prepared for. One, imagine what would have happened if the US did not go into this tariff game. Trump would have again weakened US institutions, and that would have had an impact on the tech sector, on other innovations, on other businesses. And I think we could expect a instability perhaps 4 or 5 years time, so some of it after Trump actually. But with the tariffs, he's actually bringing those much earlier, and he's creating a new source of instability which will intersect with those institutional induced recessions. So we could see a recession, I think, next year if this tariff game continues economy. And if, as it seems likely, at some point a Trump induced recession arrives, it will not be an American recession, it will be a global recession.
Okay, Professor Acemoglu, your research on why countries succeed or fail won you the Nobel Prize. In your book, Why Nations Fail, which you co-authored, you cited how democratic institutions are critical to a nation's success. You cited the US as a great example, but that was in your book over a decade ago. What do you make about the United States as a nation today?
Well, I think we wrote that book 15 years ago, and even there we did discuss that the path of US success has been much more uncertain. US institutions showed flexibility, but they had many weaknesses. That's a point that we actually emphasized further in a book that we wrote about 6 years, 7 years ago, The Narrow Corridor. But even since the 6 year landmark that has happened over the now that we're seeing, huge changes have happened in US institutions. Their weaknesses have been pried open both during the Biden presidency, but especially after Donald Trump has come to power. And for once, I think there is a real danger that the US Republic, US democracy could collapse. Now, if we go back to Why Nations Fail, it's ironic that some of the lines that we wrote in that book with advice to emerging economies, such as India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, those in Latin America, now apply to the United States. The danger is really undermining inclusive institutions and failing to build the institutions for a new age that we require. And for the US, the problem is that the effects are going to be slow because people still have trust in US institutions. They are normalizing these changes. But once it comes, it's going to have really deep consequences.
Okay, let's zoom into one of those institutions, the independence of the US central bank. Trump is unhappy with the Fed chair. Trump, of course, remains unhappy about high interest rates. What would you say to those who agree with Trump that the Fed should, in fact, cut rates to prevent a fallout from those tariffs?
Well, I think it is true that there is going to be a lot of turbulence. And when that comes, it may well be that central banks around the world may need to stimulate the economy. And also the independence of the central bank, which is such an important bulwark of stability in the United States, requires that experts in the central bank make that decision, not politicians. Politicians calling for lower interest rate is something we had left behind. But of course, Trump is bringing the worst in the political system. And the argument that I have created this mess and this mess should be accommodated by lower interest rates is really very hypocritical.
Okay, Professor Acemoglu, before we let you go, this has been a question on the minds of many Indians. When you won the Nobel Prize a few months ago, you shared the news by posting an article from Pune News, which is not a mainstream news outlet from India. Why did you pick Pune News for your choice?
I don't remember. It must have been, I don't use Twitter very regularly. I must have seen it and something must have appealed and I must have retweeted it, but I don't actually remember. I'm sorry. I like, some of the comments and the things I see from Indian press. It's like rich, diverse country with an amazing history. So I'm sure I was taken by some aspect of it.
That exclusive interview with Daron Acemoglu, more can be found on our YouTube channel.